The first time the bear returned, the old man thought he was dreaming. It was early morning, the frost still silvering the edges of the fields, when he heard the heavy steps on the porch. He opened the door, expecting the wind or a stray deer, but there it was. Not a cub anymore, but a full-grown bear, standing exactly where it had all those years ago, its dark eyes fixed on him. The sound that woke him wasn't the wind, it was heavier, more deliberate. The old man sat up slowly in his bed, listening. Outside, the frost still clung thick to the fields, the early morning light just starting to spill pale across the land. He heard it again, a steady thump, then a pause, then another thump. Steps. He pushed aside the wool blanket, feeling the chill bite through his socks as he crossed the wooden floor to the front door. His hand paused on the latch. For a second, he thought about his old shotgun propped in the corner. But the sound wasn't frantic, it was steady. Familiar, somehow. When he pulled the door open, the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sharp tang of frost. And there, at the far edge of the porch steps, stood a bear. It was massive, broad shoulders, thick coat shimmering in the pale light, breath steaming in the air. But it wasn't moving toward him. It stood still, its dark eyes locked on his, head tilted just slightly to one side. The old man's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. And then, like a memory unfolding in his mind, he knew. It was the same bear. The same one he'd found years ago, when it was no more than a half-frozen cub barely clinging to life. He could still remember the day, the snow falling in heavy sheets, the tiny bundle of fur curled on the porch, too weak to even whimper. He'd carried it inside, wrapped it in his coat, fed it warm milk from a bottle meant for calves. For weeks, it had slept beside the stove on an old quilt, recovering inch by inch. When spring came, he'd walked it to the edge of the forest. It had looked back at him once before vanishing into the trees. He'd told himself he'd never see it again. But here it was. The bear shifted its weight, the wood of the porch creaking under its paws. Its eyes stayed on him, unblinking, calm. Not a threat. Not a stray wanderer. A visitor. The old man stepped outside, letting the door fall shut behind him. He stood just a few feet away now, the air between them misted with their breath. He could see the small white scar above its right eye, one he remembered from when it had stumbled into a fence post as a cub. For a long time, they simply stood there. No words, no movement, just the sound of the frost melting slowly on the porch rail. Finally, the bear took one slow step forward. The man didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of its presence, the deep, quiet understanding in its eyes. Then, as silently as it had come, the bear turned, stepped down from the porch, and walked toward the tree line. The man watched until it disappeared into the shadows of the pines. He stood there for several minutes after, his breath still clouding in the cold air, feeling the echo of something that had begun long ago and wasn't over yet. The first spring after he released the cub came and went without incident. The fields greened, the river thawed, and life returned to its quiet rhythm. He didn't expect to see it again. Bears moved on. That was the way of things. The following year was the same, seasons passing in their familiar cycle. But on a late autumn morning, nearly 3 years after that winter rescue, something changed. He was sitting at the kitchen table, mending a tear in his work shirt, when he heard the boards of the porch groan under a weight. It wasn't the sharp step of a person or the light trot of a dog. This was slower, heavier. He froze, listening. When he opened the door, the cold hit him first, sharp and clean, smelling faintly of damp leaves. Then he saw it. A large brown bear stood at the bottom of the steps. Its coat was thick and healthy, catching the pale morning sun in warm shades of gold and deep chestnut. Its head was tilted slightly, and its dark eyes were locked on him with an intensity that went beyond the wariness of a wild animal. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he noticed the scar, small, pale, just above the right eye. It couldn't be. He stepped onto the porch slowly, his boots creaking against the old wood. The bear didn't flinch. He stopped a few feet from the steps, studying it. The size was different now, but the posture, the stillness, it was the same. The bear shifted its weight, not forward, not back, just a subtle adjustment, as if to say, "I know you." He didn't know what possessed him, but he spoke aloud. "You remember, don't you?" The bear blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, then turned its head toward the tree line before looking back. It didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It simply stayed, breathing slow, visible plumes of warm air rising in the cold. They stood like that for minutes, the silence filled only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And then, as quietly as it had come, the bear stepped back, descended into the yard, and padded toward the forest. He stayed on the porch, watching until its form was swallowed by shadow. That night, he sat by the stove with a mug of tea, the flicker of the flames casting shadows across the walls. He thought about the look in the bear's eyes, that strange calm, not quite domesticated but not entirely wild either. Over the next weeks, life went on. But something in him had shifted. Every creak of the porch boards made him pause. Every morning, he found himself glancing toward the tree line. The following autumn, just as the air began to bite with the first frost, it happened again. This time, he was splitting wood by the shed when he caught sight of movement across the field. He straightened, leaning on the axe handle, and saw the bear emerging from the forest. Same scar. Same measured steps. It walked to the porch, stopped at the exact same spot as before, and stood still, watching him. The old man set the axe down, brushed the sawdust from his gloves, and made his way across the yard. He didn't reach for it. He didn't try to feed it. He just stood there, a few feet away, breathing the same cold air, letting the moment settle between them. And then, just like before, the bear turned, walked back to the trees, and was gone. By the third year, he'd stopped doubting. He knew it would come. Always in autumn, always after the first frost, always to the same porch. The first spring after he released the cub came and went without incident. The fields greened, the river thawed, and life returned to its quiet rhythm. He didn't expect to see it again. Bears moved on. That was the way of things. The following year was the same, seasons passing in their familiar cycle. But on a late autumn morning, nearly 3 years after that winter rescue, something changed. He was sitting at the kitchen table, mending a tear in his work shirt, when he heard the boards of the porch groan under a weight. It wasn't the sharp step of a person or the light trot of a dog. This was slower, heavier. He froze, listening. When he opened the door, the cold hit him first, sharp and clean, smelling faintly of damp leaves. Then he saw it. A large brown bear stood at the bottom of the steps. Its coat was thick and healthy, catching the pale morning sun in warm shades of gold and deep chestnut. Its head was tilted slightly, and its dark eyes were locked on him with an intensity that went beyond the wariness of a wild animal. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he noticed the scar, small, pale, just above the right eye. It couldn't be. He stepped onto the porch slowly, his boots creaking against the old wood. The bear didn't flinch. He stopped a few feet from the steps, studying it. The size was different now, but the posture, the stillness, it was the same. The bear shifted its weight, not forward, not back, just a subtle adjustment, as if to say, "I know you." He didn't know what possessed him, but he spoke aloud. "You remember, don't you?" The bear blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, then turned its head toward the tree line before looking back. It didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It simply stayed, breathing slow, visible plumes of warm air rising in the cold. They stood like that for minutes, the silence filled only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And then, as quietly as it had come, the bear stepped back, descended into the yard, and padded toward the forest. He stayed on the porch, watching until its form was swallowed by shadow. That night, he sat by the stove with a mug of tea, the flicker of the flames casting shadows across the walls. He thought about the look in the bear's eyes, that strange calm, not quite domesticated but not entirely wild either. Over the next weeks, life went on. But something in him had shifted. Every creak of the porch boards made him pause. Every morning, he found himself glancing toward the tree line. The following autumn, just as the air began to bite with the first frost, it happened again. This time, he was splitting wood by the shed when he caught sight of movement across the field. He straightened, leaning on the axe handle, and saw the bear emerging from the forest. Same scar. Same measured steps. It walked to the porch, stopped at the exact same spot as before, and stood still, watching him. The old man set the axe down, brushed the sawdust from his gloves, and made his way across the yard. He didn't reach for it. He didn't try to feed it. He just stood there, a few feet away, breathing the same cold air, letting the moment settle between them. And then, just like before, the bear turned, walked back to the trees, and was gone. By the third year, he'd stopped doubting. He knew it would come. Always in autumn, always after the first frost, always to the same porch. By the fourth year, it wasn't just a visit, it had become a ritual. The old man would start watching for it as soon as the first frost dusted the grass. He'd rise earlier, keep the porch swept of snow, and make sure the path from the yard to the steps stayed clear. He told himself it was just habit, but deep down, he knew he was preparing. That year, the morning was still and silver when it came. The bear stepped from the shadows of the pines like it had simply been waiting for the right moment. Its coat was thick and unruffled, its steps deliberate but unhurried. It stopped in the same spot at the base of the porch, the boards groaning faintly under its weight as it shifted its stance. The old man was already outside, sitting in his worn rocking chair, a heavy wool sweater drawn close around his shoulders. He didn't move at first, just let their eyes meet in that quiet way they always did. For a long time, neither of them made a sound. The only noise was the faint creak of the chair and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Then, in a slow, steady motion, the bear stepped onto the first porch step. The old man's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest, but he didn't rise. The bear climbed one more step and paused, close enough now that he could see the scar clearly and the deep, even breath moving through its frame. It stayed there for several minutes, head turning slightly as if taking in the familiar scent of the place. Then, without warning, it lowered itself onto its haunches and simply sat. The man's brow furrowed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't sure what it meant, if it meant anything at all, but the moment felt different. Eventually, the bear rose, backed down the steps, and returned to the yard. When it reached the tree line, it turned its head once before vanishing into the forest. Year after year, the visits continued. Always in late autumn, always after the first frost. The man began to notice small changes in the bear, slight graying around its muzzle, a slower, more measured pace. He supposed he had changed too. His hair had gone whiter, his hands more lined, his back a little stiffer when he stood. On the 7th year, the bear stayed longer. It lingered near the steps as the man sat on the porch, sipping coffee from a tin mug. Once, it even lowered its massive frame to the porch boards and lay there, head resting on its paws, eyes half closed as if the sound of the man's breathing was enough to keep it at ease. Neighbors began to hear about it, of course. In a small town, stories traveled fast. But no one tried to interfere. They all knew some things weren't meant to be disrupted. By the 10th year, the man no longer thought of the visits as rare or strange. They were simply part of his life's rhythm, as sure as the changing leaves or the first snow. Each time, the bear came quietly, stood or sat in its familiar place, and left just as silently. It never took food. It never came closer than it chose. And yet, each visit felt like a conversation without words, a reminder that some connections endure, no matter the years or the distance between. It was the 12th year when something broke the pattern. The first frost had come and gone, but no bear appeared. The old man told himself not to expect it. Wild animals had their own rhythms. Still, he kept the porch swept clear of snow, a small act he couldn't stop himself from doing. A week passed. Then 2. Winter deepened. He began to wonder if time had finally taken its course, if the bear had simply grown old in the forest and not seen another winter through. Then, one morning, a sound woke him, a sound he hadn't heard in over a year. Heavy, deliberate steps on the porch boards. He rose from his chair by the stove, heart beating faster than he liked to admit, and opened the door. There it was. But something was different. The bear's coat was damp, patches of fur pressed flat, as if it had pushed through thick snow or ice. It moved more slowly, its breath heavier in the cold air. The scar above its eye was still there, but now its muzzle showed clear streaks of white. It stopped at the bottom step and just looked at him. And for the first time in all these years, the old man stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, he descended the steps until he stood on the frozen ground just a few feet from the bear. The wind shifted, carrying the familiar scent of pine and cold earth. The bear's eyes stayed on him, steady and unafraid. "You made it," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness. The bear lowered itself into the snow, folding its legs beneath its bulk, and sat there. The man stood with it for a long time, the cold seeping through his boots, neither of them moving much. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of years, of remembered winters and quiet mornings. Then, in a motion so uncharacteristic it startled him, the bear leaned forward slightly, lowering its head just enough that its muzzle was almost level with his chest. The old man didn't reach out, he knew better than to cross that line, but he stood steady, letting the moment last. Eventually, the bear rose, slow and deliberate, and turned toward the forest. It didn't glance back this time. It simply disappeared into the line of trees, leaving deep prints in the snow that the man watched until the wind began to blur them. That night, as he sat by the stove with the quilt pulled over his knees, he felt a weight in his chest, not sadness, not exactly, but the awareness that their meetings were finite. Nothing in nature lasted forever. Still, the next morning, he swept the porch again. Just in case. The 15th winter came in hard and early. By mid-November, the drifts along the fence line were already waist-high, and the wind off the hills carried a low, constant howl. The old man kept to the cabin more than usual, tending the stove, rationing his trips outside to fetch wood. For years, the visits had been predictable, always after the first frost, usually before the snow piled deep. But now, with blizzards sweeping in week after week, he told himself it would be different. The bear would have denayed early. It would be safer for it to stay away. Still, every morning, he stepped onto the porch, the cold biting through his coat, and scanned the white horizon. And every morning, it was just wind and snow. One evening, after a day of relentless storm, the wind suddenly died. The world outside went still, muffled in thick, unbroken snow. He was stacking logs by the stove when he heard it, the unmistakable creak of the porch boards under a heavy weight. He froze, listening. A moment later, another step. Heart quickening, he opened the door. The snow in the yard was deep enough to swallow the tops of his boots, but there, breaking the smooth expanse, was a massive shape moving toward him. The bear. Its fur was dusted white, clumps of snow clinging to its legs and belly. The scar above its eye was visible even in the dim evening light, and its breath came in slow, visible clouds. Each step was deliberate, the snow giving way under its weight. The old man stepped out, the cold air searing his lungs. The bear stopped a few feet from the porch and stood there, steam rising from its coat where the snow was melting against the warmth of its body. "You shouldn't be out in this," the man said softly, though he knew the bear didn't come for his advice. They stood together in the stillness, the only sound the faint drip of melting snow from the porch roof. The air between them felt charged, not with fear, but with the rare electricity of something impossible and yet undeniably real. For a moment, the bear's head lowered slightly, its eyes steady on his. The man didn't move closer, but he felt the same quiet recognition that had been there since the first return. After a long pause, the bear turned, plowing its way back across the yard toward the dark line of trees. Snow shifted around its legs as it moved, swallowing its tracks almost as fast as it made them. When it disappeared into the forest, the old man stayed on the porch, letting the cold sting his cheeks until the warmth from the stove called him back inside. Later, as he sat by the fire with the quilt pulled over his knees, he thought about the effort it must have taken for the bear to come through the storm. It wasn't need, it was choice. And that, more than anything, was why he knew he'd keep watching for it, no matter how many winters passed. It was the middle of July, the kind of day when the air hung heavy and the smell of warm earth rolled in from the fields. The old man was sitting on the porch with his hat tipped low, mending a length of rope, when he heard the sound of something large moving through the tall grass. At first, he thought it might be a deer or even a moose wandering close to the fence. But the sound was steady, deliberate, more like the slow push of a body that knew exactly where it was going. He sat forward, squinting into the glare of the sun. The grass parted near the far side of the yard, and there it was. The bear. It had been less than a year since the last visit, and never before had it come in the summer. The thick, rich brown of its coat shimmered in the heat, darker patches damp with sweat from the walk. The scar above its right eye caught the sunlight like a pale thread woven into the fur. The old man rose slowly, leaning one hand on the porch rail. "Well," he muttered, "this is new." The bear crossed the yard without hesitation, its massive paws silent on the packed dirt path. It stopped at the foot of the porch and lifted its head, eyes meeting his. There was no urgency in its gaze, no sign of distress, only the same steady recognition that had marked every visit. But there was something else this time. It didn't just stand there. The bear moved to the side of the porch, the exact spot where the steps met the shadow of the overhang, and settled down on its belly. Its breathing was slow, its eyes half-lidded, as if it had come simply to rest. The old man sat back in his rocking chair, keeping his movements easy. He could hear the rhythmic huff of the bear's breath beneath the hum of cicadas in the trees. Every so often, it would glance up at him, then let its head fall back to the ground. For nearly an hour, they stayed like that, man and bear in the heat, the sun arcing slowly toward the western tree-line. At one point, the old man poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher beside his chair and, after a moment's thought, tipped a little into the shallow basin he used for the porch plants. The bear's ear twitched at the sound, and it rose, padding forward to lap quietly from the basin. Its tongue moved slow, deliberate, the water rippling in the sunlight. When it finished, it stood there a moment, water dripping from its muzzle, before returning to the patch of shade. As the day cooled, the bear rose and walked back toward the tall grass. It didn't glance back this time, disappearing into the green like it had always been part of it. The old man sat for a long while after, his rope forgotten on the floorboards. Something about the visit stayed with him, not just because it had broken the pattern, but because it felt less like a ritual and more like a choice made in the moment. Maybe the bear had simply been passing through. Or maybe, after all these years, it had come to know the porch not just as a place to return in autumn, but as a place it could come to, whenever it needed. The 17th winter came in quietly, with soft snow that drifted down for days without wind. The air was still, the kind of cold that seemed to hold every sound in suspension. The old man, now moving slower than before, had taken to sitting on the porch with a blanket over his knees, watching the line of the forest. By now, the visits were fewer. 2 years had passed since the unexpected summer encounter. Last autumn had come and gone with no sign of the bear. He'd told himself not to expect it, age came for all living things. Still, every first frost, he found his eyes straying toward the yard. It was late afternoon when he heard the crunch of snow, slow, deliberate, and close. His hands tightened on the arms of the chair. From between the pines, the bear emerged. It was older now. The white along its muzzle had spread down toward its jaw, and its movements were more measured. But its eyes, deep, steady, knowing, were the same. The scar above its right eye was still visible, a mark of history that tied them together. The old man stood slowly, leaning on the porch railing. "Took your time," he murmured, his voice catching in the cold air. The bear crossed the yard without hesitation, each step pressing deep into the snow. When it reached the porch, it stopped, looking up at him. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, in a way it never had before, the bear stepped up onto the porch. The boards groaned under its weight, but it didn't stop until it stood just a few feet away from him. The man could feel the warmth of its breath on the cold air, could see the frost melting slightly where the bear's body brushed against the railing. He didn't reach out, but he didn't move away either. "Well," he said quietly, "guess we've both seen a few winters now." The bear lowered itself to the floorboards, folding its legs beneath it, and simply stayed. The old man sat back down, blanket still over his knees, and for the first time, they shared the porch itself. Minutes stretched into an hour. The light shifted from pale gold to the deep blue of early evening. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes landing on the bear's back and in the folds of the man's blanket. At one point, the bear turned its head and looked directly at him. There was no fear, no uncertainty, only the quiet presence of something that had chosen to be there. He felt an ache in his chest, the kind that came from knowing this might be the last time. When the shadows deepened and the air grew colder, the bear finally rose. It stepped back down into the yard, pausing once at the edge of the snow. For the first time in all their years, it gave a low, soft chuff, barely audible, but enough to make the man's breath catch. Then it turned and walked into the trees, vanishing into the growing dark. The old man sat there long after it had gone, the snow falling around him, the sound of that soft chuff replaying in his mind. He didn't know if he'd hear it again. But he knew he'd remember it for the rest of his days. Winter returned harder than it had in years. The storms rolled in one after another, piling snow so high the old man could barely keep a path cleared to the woodpile. He moved slower now, his back stiff, his breath shorter in the cold. The porch stayed swept, though, even on the worst days, just in case. It had been nearly 2 years since the bear's last visit. He told himself it was over. Bears aged quickly in the wild. Maybe it was gone. Maybe that soft chuff on the porch that evening had been its way of saying goodbye. Still, the habit remained. Each morning, he'd step out with his coffee, scan the white field, and look toward the shadowed tree-line. Then, one morning in early February, it happened. The snow was falling lightly, the kind that clung to every branch and rail. He was sitting in his chair by the stove when he heard it, the deep, slow creak of the porch boards. He set his mug down carefully and stood. When he opened the door, the cold swept in like a tide. And there it was. The bear stood at the bottom of the porch steps, older than he had ever seen it. The white fur along its muzzle had spread over its face, and its movements were slower, heavier. But its eyes, those deep, dark, steady eyes, were the same. The old man stepped forward, leaning on the railing for balance. "You made it," he said softly. The bear climbed the steps, each one groaning under its weight, until it stood once again just a few feet away. Snow clung to its back, melting in dark patches where its body heat bled through. It didn't stand long. With a slow, deliberate movement, it lowered itself to the porch floor, resting its head on its paws. Its breathing was deep, steady, and loud enough to hear over the whisper of the falling snow. The man sat down in his chair, pulling the blanket over his knees. They stayed like that for what could have been minutes or hours, just two old creatures, sharing the quiet. Now and then, the bear would lift its head slightly, as if to check that he was still there. Each time, he'd meet its gaze and give the smallest nod. He didn't speak much. There didn't seem to be a need. The moment was already saying everything. As the day slid toward evening, the light turned soft and gold, reflecting off the snow. The bear rose slowly, joints stiff, and stepped down from the porch. At the edge of the yard, it stopped and turned its head back, holding his gaze for a long heartbeat. Then, with the slow, deliberate steps of something that had no reason to rush, it walked into the trees until the forest swallowed it whole. The old man stood on the porch long after it had gone, the snow falling gently around him. Deep down, he knew he might never see it again. But that didn't feel like loss, it felt like the closing of a circle. The rest of that winter passed quietly. Snow came and went, sometimes falling in thick curtains that erased the horizon, sometimes melting into the soft earth that waited for spring. The old man kept to his routine, chopping wood, tending the stove, making slow walks to the fence line when the sun was out. But every time he stepped onto the porch, he found himself glancing toward the trees. He told himself not to expect anything. That February afternoon might have been the last time. Still, hope had a way of hanging around, even when it had no reason to. Spring arrived early that year. The ice on the river cracked and ran fast, carrying bits of broken branches downstream. Birds returned to the hedgerows. The air was softer, though still cool in the mornings. One day, while mending a section of fence at the edge of the field, he caught sight of something in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, shadows moving at the forest's edge. But then he saw it clearly. The bear. It was thinner now, its steps slower, but it moved with the same steady purpose it always had. The sunlight caught the white on its muzzle, making it seem even older, more dignified. It didn't come all the way to the porch this time. Instead, it stopped halfway across the yard and stood still. The old man leaned on the fence post, meeting its gaze across the open space. Neither moved for a long time. Then the bear did something it had never done before. It gave a low, deep chuff, the sound it had made once, years earlier on that snowy evening, and then turned back toward the forest. He watched it go, the sunlight glinting off its fur until the trees swallowed it up. And for the first time, he didn't wait for it to come back. He knew. That summer, the old man sat on his porch most evenings, watching the shadows stretch across the fields. The visits had stopped, but the space between them had been filled with years of quiet, unspoken companionship, enough to last him the rest of his days. And in the stillness, sometimes, he could almost hear the heavy steps on the porch boards again, feel the calm presence at his side, and see those dark, steady eyes looking back at him. It wasn't absence he felt, but gratitude that in the vastness of the wild, in the unpredictability of nature, a bond had formed between two lives that should never have crossed, and yet had. The porch remained swept. Just in case.